customer fixture in Springfield manufacturing may be headed overseas because of one word: tariffs. To learn more about Indian Motorcycle's history in the region and how international tariffs are affecting businesses here at home, I spoke with Robert Gerard, Springfield Museum's Indian motorcycle expert, and Mark Howard, a professor and economist from Springfield College.
Tariffs in general they're a tax, and they're going to increase the price of goods, and they're going to lower the quantity sold. So they're going to reduce GDP both abroad and in the United States. So that's the overall way that they'll affect the economy.
And then when you heard, whether it was a few weeks ago, Harley-Davidson saying they might consider moving production overseas, and now more recently and closer to home, Indian Motorcycles saying that they're considering the same move, what did you think?
Well, you can't blame them. They would see significant increase in costs if they were to continue to produce here and sell overseas. So the motorcycles sold in Europe would have a much higher price tag if they don't produce them in Europe, which is why they want to move overseas to produce them there.
Now, Mr. Gerard, we haven't seen Indian produced here in some years, but 1901, the roots of Indian motorcycle, no R, right. Rooted here in Springfield, 1901. Give us a little bit of the history, if you would.
Well, it really begins with two men, George Hendy, who was the national champion bicycle racer in the United States. He rode 309 races and won 302 of them. So he was a champion, and that's really how the motorcycle got started, was in the bicycle. And George Hendy, along with someone he met in New York City, Carl Oskar Hedström, who was a Swedish immigrant, a genius engineer and designer, had developed an early prototype motorcycle. It was a pacing vehicle for bicycles, used at races. And when Hendy and Hedström get together, they decide to start a company here in Springfield, which was the center of manufacturing in this area. I mean, just tremendous powerhouse of industry.
A lot of activity going on in the region at that time.
Tremendous amount. And they found a company that is eventually called the Indian Motorcycle Company. 1901, they produced the first prototype, a diamond-shaped framed vehicle powered by a gasoline-powered internal combustion engine. Becomes one of the very first motorcycle, later to become motorcycle.
And so now let's fast forward a bit in history to 1953, a very different point in the company's history where they're closing. As I understand it, there was some international pressure that sort of drove that. Can you talk about that?
Yes, well, the company had various ups and downs throughout its history, a lot of it surrounding the two world wars. In the First World War, Indian got the contract to provide all of the motorcycles for the troops in World War I. And it was tremendous for the company in many ways, in that when the U.S. government asked them to produce motorcycles, they produced 32,000 of them the first year. Right outside their plant here in Springfield, not all that far from this studio on State Street, they were producing 20,000 motorcycles a year. And the problem with that was they lost a lot of their local dealerships. The public lost a little bit of interest in them. Their rival, Harley-Davidson, which produces their motorcycles about 2.5 years after Indian, starts to take the market.
And so then eventually led to the closing of that company. But more recently, we saw Polaris pick up the brand in 2011. But Professor, since the company, Indian, has said they're considering, they're weighing this, maybe they'll move a portion of or all of the manufacturing to Poland. What are they looking at from a company perspective to say, okay, we'll stay in here in the U.S. No, we really need to move to Poland?
Well, I think they're looking at what a lot of companies are looking at. Is this trade war really going to be an ongoing trade war? I think the Trump administration is using the threat of a trade war to try to gain concessions. And if that works, then the tariffs will come down. And that's the hope, I believe, is that the threat of the trade war will force the EU to lower tariffs that they've had in place, higher tariffs that they've had in place. Many people don't think it's going to work. Looking at history, looking at the way that virtually all of our allies have responded, as well as China, what happens when you impose tariffs is they reciprocate.
Which was what we've seen in this specific instance.
Exactly.
But when you look at history and you say, like, oh, we need to understand, or we need to wait and see how long, or how long a company might need to wait to see what the impact might be, what does history tell us about how long something like this might go on?
Well, we don't have a lot of history to work with. This country has lowered tariffs since the Great Depression. The trade war.
Smoot-Hawley, 1930s, right?
Back then, it didn't cause the Great Depression, but many economists think it made it worse. And since then, the United States has been the leader in lowering tariffs. We've been a champion of free trade, virtually across party lines. Both Republicans and Democrats have been in favor of lower tariffs and in free trade. And so we don't have a lot of evidence as to what happens when the biggest economy in the world by far, the biggest player in the market, starts imposing pretty significant tariffs and pushing others into a trade war. So we don't really know, and this is what's really roiling the markets up and down. We see the stock market go through periods where they're really worried about the trade war, and we see a couple weeks ago the market went down 11 out of 13 days. Then it goes through a period, well, maybe it's not going to be that bad, maybe it won't really happen. There's a lot of uncertainty with this particular trade war. We aren't sure whether we're fully in it yet, whether it's going to be a month or it's going to be years. So we don't know.
With the phrase trade war, we're hearing that a ton lately. Is there you can't really leaf through the dictionary and say, okay, definition of trade war, and yes, we are now in it. But how do you then determine, it doesn't even matter, if you can put a trade war stamp on this type of situation?
Well, just to give you some perspective, our average tariffs in this country before this all happened, we were under 2% for the average tariffs. Tariffs are a tax on goods coming into the country. They only apply to the goods coming in. They don't apply to the domestically produced version. And so we were under 2% on average. They were among the lowest in the world, the United States tariffs. Now, as we can see, in certain instances, they're going up to 25%. Other countries are retaliating. And so, again, most economists, most people think that Trump did this in order to force other countries to lower their tariffs. And he really believed that... He
said again and again he wants people to be good partners in this.
Right, and so he believes, in others have argued this as well, that it's really a zero-sum game, that when other countries win, we must be losing. And most economists don't view it that way. Most economists view trade as not a zero-sum game. We both win from trade.
Where do you see this issue heading?
Well, again, there's a lot of uncertainty. I don't see the Europeans backing down. I don't see China backing down. And again, I don't see the president understanding that it is not a zero-sum game. We all win from trade. All economies sell more goods. All economies can consume more when we have free trade and low tariffs.
Companies will always, like Indian just announced, they may produce some of their products over in Poland, again in response so they won't have to pay the EU tariffs. They're trying to respond so that they can sell their goods at a price in which people will buy them. Harley-Davidson made the same claim recently. So yes, they employ about 650 people in Spirit Lake, Iowa currently. When Polaris took over Indian, bought the whole brand name, started producing a beautiful line of new vehicles in 2013. But they fear that in response, with these tariffs, the EU tariffs in response to US tariffs, they simply will not be able to sell their motorcycles overseas at a reasonable price. So this is why they're considering the move.
Professor, Mr. Gerard, thanks for coming in today.